Hey y'all, Dr. Keisha Green here, and welcome to Lesson 3 of the Culturally Responsive Teaching 101 course. This lesson will center around the topics of racial justice and social justice. In this lesson, we will go over what racial justice is, what social justice is, as well as define oppression. We will also go over 3 strategies that will aid you with ensuring that racial and social justice are present in the classroom. By the end of this lesson, learners should be able to define what racial and social justice mean, connect the information gained to their own teaching practice, describe 3 racial and social justice strategies, and evaluate their own teaching practice and understand how to grow it to be more centered around racial and social justice being present in the classroom. Let's begin this lesson by thinking about a classroom or a school that you might work at in the future. Start by thinking about the students that you might serve and the varying races and ethnicities of those students. Next, think about your own race and or ethnicity and how it might be similar or different from those students. Now, imagine that you are a student and your teacher has designed a lesson that you are unable to complete or participate in because it does not align with your culture or your own beliefs, expectations, or values. How would you feel if you were not able to participate in the activity or the event that your peers were able to participate in? Now imagine if during a lesson a teacher was regularly speaking to you negatively or not calling on you if you had your hand raised and you could not understand why. How would you feel then? Next, imagine that you walked into a room and everyone is speaking another language that you do not understand. What if, in this scenario, everyone looked dramatically different from you and you did not feel as though you fit in at all? How would you feel then? In the scenarios, there were barriers that existed that prevented you from fully participating in the activity or the lesson. While these barriers were not explicitly stated, they were evident through you not being able to participate in the same capacity as your peers. The purpose of this reflective activity is to give you an idea of the many unspoken barriers that students might encounter if racial justice is not present in a classroom. The goal for the end of this lesson is to help you understand what racial justice means and to aid you with gaining teaching practices that will allow you to establish a classroom that is centered around racial justice being present. So, what is racial justice? Racial justice exists when individuals from underrepresented racial and/or ethnic groups are viewed as equals and have equal opportunities to access the same outcomes as the given racial majority. With racial justice, there is recognition that structural racism plays a part in the establishment of barriers, and these barriers prevent certain individuals of underrepresented groups from having full access to all of the available opportunities or activities. For every student to have equal access or the opportunity to access the same outcomes, it means that equitable supports, modifications, or accommodations might need to be put into place. Just as with the reflective activity at the beginning, some students regularly encounter barriers to their learning. To allow these students to have equal access to the same opportunity as their peers, educators should address the barriers and should provide the necessary modifications or accommodations that will aid these students and allow these students to overcome these barriers more easily. Along with the presence of racial justice, there needs to be a presence of social justice in classrooms. Social justice is defined as individuals having access to the same opportunities and having equal rights as their peers. For social justice to exist, everyone should have access to the resources or the supports that they might require to thrive in any situation. In the classroom setting, social justice is fostered when educators are aware and acknowledge the existence of oppression that hinders students from fully accessing the same opportunities as their peers. Oppression is any type of discrimination that a social group experiences over time and that is reinforced by the structural system. Social groups are understood to be groups of individuals who all share connecting characteristics. Some of those common characteristics include race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, ability, and many others. With oppression, there have been obstacles in place or actions exhibited that all work to keep a majority group in power and these underrepresented social groups out of power. When there is a lack of awareness about the presence or even the existence of oppression, it means that students who are connected to certain social groups may encounter discrimination that is unknowingly embedded into the systems they move through. To gain a better understanding of potential oppression that might exist in the classroom, let's look at Mr. Johnson's ninth grade history class. The demographics of the class are as follows. There are 15 boys and 6 girls. 2 of the students share cultural backgrounds, and 19 of the students, along with Mr. Johnson, share the same cultural backgrounds. Being that there is a cultural majority, with 19 students and Mr. Johnson having the same cultural background, there may be embedded barriers for the students who are in the smaller cultural group. In order to prevent these students from encountering any barriers or negative experiences due to being in the cultural underrepresented group, Mr. Johnson must hold awareness and make it a point to ensure that all of his students are treated fairly. Through using equitable practices, Mr. Johnson can work to ensure that all students have access to the same opportunities. If Mr. Johnson were only to teach with the cultural majority students in mind and were to explicitly ignore the structural barriers that might be in place, as well as the presence of 2 students who hold cultural differences from his own, then it might mean that not all the students were given the same access to the same opportunities. Further, those in the majority group would be given an unfair advantage or unfair privilege because they shared a cultural background with Mr. Johnson, as well as Mr. Johnson catering to this cultural majority instead of considering all of the students' cultural backgrounds. To ensure that social justice does exist in the classroom, educators need to believe that all of their students deserve to have access to the same educational or learning opportunities, and also to ensure that all the students hold the same rights in the learning environment. Educators should also hold the understanding that their students might be encountering oppression. Educators should consider that oppression might be impacting the experiences of the students in a negative capacity. It is important for you as an educator to first identify any biases or those attitudes or thoughts about a group or individual that might be preventing your students from having access to the same opportunities. The process needed to address bias will be discussed in lesson number 4. While we will go over how to address bias later, it is important for educators to have an awareness that bias can impact whether racial and or social justice is upheld in the classroom. Educators should recognize that each of their students will be entering the learning environment with their own unique learning needs. Now that you have an understanding of what racial and social justice means, we will now learn about some equitable practices that you can implement to create a learning and school environment that is centered around racial and social justice existing in the classroom. The first strategy is to allow students and families to be co-constructors of knowledge. Students should not only learn from the teacher, but the teacher should likewise have opportunities to learn from the student. As the educator, you should also recognize that your students will be able to help you learn or can provide you with knowledge. Educators should invite and encourage families or community members to become sources of knowledge for students. Through collectively constructing knowledge, it allows for students to be exposed to more perspectives and understandings that they might not have encountered if they were only lectured at. The second strategy is to have a universal design for learning or UDL mindset. In this sense, UDL is a framework that centers around providing flexibility in the assessment of student knowledge, flexibility in how information is presented or shared, and flexibility of the engagement tools that are used during lessons or learning activities. Through a UDL perspective, educators aim to provide necessary accommodations or modifications that will allow students to have access to the learning materials and the opportunity to fully engage during times of learning. UDL centers around 3 key principles, which include 1. Educators implementing various engagement tools, 2. Educators utilizing varied learning materials, and 3. Educators using varied strategies for assessing student understanding of the learning materials. UDL calls for the educator to present lessons or implement learning activities that will meet the individual learning styles of the students. Some students might be visual learners, while others might be kinesthetic learners. And the lessons and even the assessments that educators provide, they should use learning materials that will align with the varied learning styles of their students. The third practice is to bridge cultures. Bridging cultures means that you try to bring together individuals or groups from different backgrounds. As an educator, this might mean you work with your school to collaborate with families who represent varying backgrounds from the school majority. In your classroom, you will try to ensure that your students are able to collaborate and work together despite any differences they might have. Try to guide students through building the skills needed to collaborate or engage in an activity with peers who may be different from them. It is important for students to embrace their differences and the differences of others rather than fear them. Let's return to Mr. Johnson's class. Mr. Johnson is aware that some of his students hold cultural backgrounds that are different from his own. Mr. Johnson provides opportunities for students to understand different perspectives that aid them with building their skills around working with people that might have different backgrounds from their own. For a few lessons, he asks those students and their families to share and teach the class about their traditions. Mr. Johnson also knows that he has visual, kinesthetic, and tactile learners in his classroom. With every lesson, he tries to find activities or learning materials that align with the varying learning styles of his students. In his class, Mr. Johnson tries to bridge cultures, allowing students and families to be co-constructors of knowledge, and tries to implement UDL practices to fully support students with their learning. With all of these practices being implemented by Mr. Johnson, it aids him with working towards establishing a learning environment that centers around the presence of racial and social justice. As an educator, it's important to reflect and connect the information and insight we gain to our own teaching practice. I want you to take time and pause to think about how you can grow your teaching practice to be more centered around racial and social justice being present in the classroom. On the next slide, you will find the references that were used to shape this lesson, and at the end of this video, you will find the discussion board number 4 question. So once you are done with your self-reflection, please continue on and be sure to answer the discussion board question in the comment section. I thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lesson video.